Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane. I'm the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. I'm very excited to be here for the second time with Greg Ketchen talking about shipwrecks. Although last time we talked about the history of the Coast Guard, which was fascinating. And I'll send out a link to that video after our talk today. But before we get to Greg, I just want to say a couple things. One is I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. And I'd also like to thank Greg for letting us share this program with other libraries. I can't tell you how fast 42 libraries signed on to partner for this program. Obviously, all of our communities are interested in this topic. So I was really, really excited about that. So Greg's going to have a presentation. You can see his first slide is up on the screen. He's going to be talking for about 35 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, which is at the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will be turning the chat off during his slides just so that nobody is distracted and annoyed because nobody likes that. So as I mentioned, Greg Ketchen, he is a retired U.S. Coast Guard captain living in Osterville, Massachusetts. He is a volunteer at the Coast Guard Heritage Museum, and he is so knowledgeable about everything Coast Guard, military, related. And I'm curious to see how he winds in the Coast Guard to shipwrecks. This is going to be a fascinating conversation. Greg, welcome. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah. Um, and good afternoon. This talk is about shipwrecks, I hope. And shipwrecks are sort of have a lot of personal impact on my life. Frankly, there are several incidents that have occurred involving shipwrecks indirectly or directly. They're not a particularly happy topic in most cases. I can think of very few cases where they're happy, but they're an intriguing subject. It has led to numerous films, numerous books, literature, paintings. It is part of our culture. Kind of a morbid curiosity, frankly, because most of the shipwrecks very often end up in certainly loss of property, but even loss of life, in some cases, significant loss of life. So I'll be touching on that today. So I'm going to be jumping around a little bit, but basically going through some examples of shipwrecks and how they happen, the cause of them, the response to them, both the immediate response to helping to save people, but the longer term response to see about what can be done to prevent further shipwrecks to occur from occurring. So, should point out there have been by count, not by count, but estimate about 3 million shipwrecks in the course of human history. About 1% of those have been surveyed or documented, or the shipwrecks found. Many of them, the shipwrecks, the parts of the shipwreck are long dispersed, or corroded or broken up, no longer salvageable. But there are even 1% of 3 million. That's still, what is it, 30,000 shipwrecks. I'm going to try to touch on each of these 30,000 today, so we may be here for a while. The shipwrecks art. Let me go to the next slide. The Wreck of the Hesperus, I think many of you have heard about. That was a Longfellow poem. Talked about a storm in up off Gloucester in the late 1800s. It is just one of the pieces of literature, books written about that, certainly about the Titanic, for example, but seems like almost all shipwrecks have had a book written about them in one form or another. Films, The Finest Hours is one. There again, many films, The Perfect Storm, The Finest Hours, all those are. There have been 150 or more films, Hollywood films featuring Coast Guard, and most of those have been about shipwrecks or rescues of some sort. This is a picture of the Pendleton, which went down in 1952 off Gloucester, and it's a turned into a film called The Finest Hours. Came out in 2015. It I may come back to this topic a little bit with this film a little bit later. There have been. I have to start out, I guess, with the quintessential shipwreck, the Titanic. It certainly wasn't the largest shipwreck or the most loss of life, but it was the one that's been celebrated is the wrong term, but commemorated explored, filmed, and a book and so forth, as I mentioned earlier. Um, it Music is another one that has come up. Titanic was a film. Obviously, there's the music from that film. There's even music such as the Edmund Fitzgerald, which some of you may know, particularly of my generation, understand Gordon Lightfoot. It's a very popular song that was done back 30 or 40 years ago. But I'll come back to the Titanic a little bit later also. But shipwrecks come in all sorts of forms, and we'll talk about that in a second. But because some of them are in very deep water, they're preserved for long periods of time. The oldest shipwreck that we're aware of right now, the oldest vessel that we're aware of right now is 10,000 years old. There was a large canoe that was discovered in the Netherlands. But there's good evidence that there have been humans using ships or some sort of floating material to migrate across the oceans. 50,000 years ago, there was a migration down to New Guinea and Australia. It's clear that that had to be by some sort of float. It may have been rafts rather than ships, but anyway, it's been around for a long time. This desire to go out in the ocean, to migrate across the ocean, to trade, to fish, to any number of things beyond the ocean. But on the other hand, I should point out that we have evolved, or if you prefer, were created without without the ability to live in the oceans or on the oceans. It's a hostile environment for humans. We can spend a few days there, possibly, if the weather isn't too bad or too cold. It's hard for us to eat directly from the ocean. It's hard for us to obviously going under the surface of the ocean. So it's not an environment that's conducive to mankind living on it or in it, but we still go out onto it. This endurance is in still in, it was one used by Shackleton in the 1913, 1915 down in Antarctica. There were 26 people on board when it was caught in the ice, and then eventually, after more than a year, actually caught in the ice, and it crushed. And the small crew on board, 26 people, escaped by using a lifeboat, a boat that they had, and dragged it across the ice, got into open water. I won't go into great depths or detail about the endurance, but it's a fascinating event. What's um, what's fascinating to me is that this is a picture of the endurance just captured a couple of years ago, where they refound it now. It's in outstanding condition. It's almost like you could bring it back to the surface and sail it around, and realizing this is a vessel that's well over 100 years old. And this is true of a lot of vessels that have sunk in deep ocean or other places where they've been protected, that have survived. The oldest known wrecks that we're aware of, full wrecks, were there's one, most of these in Northern Europe or in the Black Sea. There was one from, I'm trying to see in my notes here, well, a few thousand years old, shipwrecks that still has a form where you can tell they were a ship at least. Shipwrecks come in various forms, I suppose. You can see here in the middle of this picture of what is a sunken vessel. Is that really a shipwreck? Well, we'll explore that in a second. But they're everywhere, frankly. Don't even know this is in Ontario. Don't even know how this one sank. Um, on Cape Cod, there have been well over 3,000 shipwrecks. So I went out exploring to see if I could find any of them. I found this one. That was a good example of one of the shipwrecks on Cape Cod. Um, I should point out that the difficulty I have right now in talking in Zoom, I'm here alone, so I can't see what the reaction is from anyone there. I am kidding about this. Also kidding about not only this being, actually, you can tell this is a miniature golf course on Cape Cod. Probably not a real shipwreck. Also, the idea of going through 3,000 shipwrecks or 30,000 shipwrecks, that's not my goal today, but I'm going to talk about several of them and go through them fairly fast. There's also a rumor that Titanic, that with the 17 or 1,500 people that died, 1,517 people that died on the Titanic, that one of those may have been, at least I saw it on film, Leonardo DiCaprio. But again, I think that's just a vicious rumor. I don't think he went down with the Titanic. Let me continue on with the definition. It's about time we define what is a shipwreck. In very simple terms, it's the destruction of a ship at sea by sinking or some otherwise breaking up. Sinking might be caused by a variety of things, and we'll go through some of that in a second. I want to lend some personal notes here before we get into this too deeply. I said that there have been many shipwrecks that impacted my life either directly or indirectly. This is the Princess Kathleen, 1952, off the coast of Alaska, sank. And my great grandfather was on the ship. Fortunately, he got off, as did no one died from it. The Coast Guard was involved in the saving of the 100 and I'm not sure how many people right now. I can look this up. It's here, 300 people on board. He was one of them, but obviously, I was quite very young at this time when it happened. But does sink into my mind that there was this event involving my great grandfather off of Alaska. It was a virtually a brand new cruise ship. It had been launched within the last year, British, and was brought up to Alaska for this cruise. So goes from that to the Coast Guard. I was fortunate to have fortunate and honored to have a great career in the Coast Guard, a very enjoyable career, a lot of different things happening, but not all days are good. The Italian Gold was a fishing vessel out of Gloucester. That was one of my stations that I had under my command when I was in Boston. And the Italian Gold was a good vessel, good crew on board. They went out as a storm. The preliminary forecast had come out, the weather forecast, that there was probably a storm developing. As they got out, heading out to the banks to do fishing, the forecast had gotten a little worse. But they'd just gotten there, and they figured we can fish for all. We've been in bad storms before. Most of the other fishing vessels that are out there were able to get back into Gloucester safely. The Italian Gold didn't make it back. It was hit by the intensity of the storm. It could have even been a rogue wave, flipped it over. We immediately got a signal, what's called EPIRB, an electronic personal indicating position indicating beacon that went up to the satellite and came down. So we know there was someone in distress out there within minutes from the time it flipped over. Happened to be a Canadian Coast Guard C-130 fixed wing aircraft in the area looking for some other vessel out there. They flew over and they saw the vessel upside down, no people in the water. The Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard from Cape Cod, got out there. This was all very close to the northern tip of the Cape, up off Provincetown, offshore there. And it went down very rapidly. The helicopter that was sent was there minutes after the Canadian fixed wing aircraft. There was nothing on left. It had gone down. It's clear that no one survived. We searched for another 3 days without any luck. Finally, were able to find it a week or two later with submersibles or a camera to go down. And fortunately, we didn't see anyone with any bodies at all. They were gone. But it's amazing. The families were very distressed. It was a very emotional moment for my wife and I. We're up there meeting with the families of the crew of the Italian Gold. And they were concerned, but we said it's time. We have to stop searching now. And they understood. They knew that this is a tough occupation. Probably I've heard many different people saying this is the most dangerous occupation in the world as far as a general occupation of fishermen. So they understood. We were at the Coast Guard station in Gloucester, and we sat down with them and gave them the full briefing. And then my wife and I, and some of the crew members walked up to the church with the family and had a very nice, not an enjoyable service. They all understood the situation. Some people aren't quite as forgiving. They say, you got to continue searching for my people for years or months after. We know they're alive out there. At some point, you know that they haven't survived and you just can't keep searching. So this is a bad day. You don't want to lose people. Obviously, that's not the goal. I was also on an icebreaker up in the Arctic in the west coast of Greenland doing surveys there. This was not a shipwreck by the definition I just defined as a shipwreck. We were looking for the sill, the shallow area at the opening of a fjord to kind of determine how many icebergs might be able to get out of the size of the icebergs that would come out of that fjord. Unfortunately, we found the sill going at a fairly good clip for a ship, maybe 5 or 6, 7 knots, came to an abrupt halt, punched a hole in the hull. And the repercussions to us there, the tragic stuff was one of the compartments was flooded that contained all our toilet paper. So we were out toilet paper for several days. Frankly, obviously kidding again. That was true, but we had other ways. It wasn't a disaster. and we were able to get off the ledge fairly soon, but for about 3 days, and repair the hole in the hull. But why do we have shipwrecks? And there are several things we can discuss. Human error, frankly, you could say that everything is human error. The fact that we've actually ventured out onto the ocean is a human error, and if that didn't happen, there wouldn't be shipwrecks. But there are some things I think we can define more as specific human error. The Nantucket Lightship, for example, was has been out on until 1985 when it was finally decommissioned and taken in. It's been out with different lightships. They would get relieved and so forth, but there has been a lightship position on Nantucket Shoals. You can see a little red dot if it comes across down the corner of the map up in here is where the lightship was located. And it was first put there in the mid 1800s. So it was there for 100, approaching 150 years. Very dangerous. They drifted off station several times. They had a lot of storms. They survived. People on a lightship were injured for different things. But the most tragic one was in the 1930s, 1934, where they were on station there. They just had a radio beacon installed. Radio beacon put out a signal so ships coming across the Atlantic could zero in on that signal and come in. This is the shipping lanes going into New York City. Um, the idea was when they get close to the lightship, they would veer off course, not go directly into the lightship, veer off course, and then continue heading into New York. Well, unfortunately, kind of eerily, I'll show this. This is the RMS Olympic. Olympic, some of you may know, along with the Britannic, were the two sister ships of the Titanic that sank 20 years before this, 22 years before this. This is a picture of the Olympic on its way into New York from Europe in early 1934, taken by one of the sailors on the lightship. Turned out that later that year, coming into that area, the Olympic ran over the Nantucket lightship, split it in half. 7 of the 11 crew members died. It was a tragic event. It was such a large vessel compared to the lightship that many of the people on board, the passengers on board the Olympic, didn't even know they hit another ship. It just cut it in half and it sank almost instantly. So another example of human error. Mother Nature clearly storms and so forth. Again, one could say that if you listen to the forecast and could predict it's human error, why even go out when there's a storm predicted? Well, obviously, weather forecasting has gotten better, but still, even today, vessels are lost because of adverse weather. Just an example or two, the Cross Rip Lightship, which is the middle of Nantucket Sound. During a winter, it was caught in the ice. It was on station, but the ice had come in and formed around it. You may appreciate that it hasn't happened, maybe not even in the last 50 years, but Nantucket Sound used to cool down enough or get frozen over so you could walk across part of it. That's part of issue with Martha's Vineyard. Some of the animals that are on Martha's Vineyard, like deer, may have come across by walking across the ice. But this was a poor look. It's ice covered here, but this is the cross rip lightship that was on station, and they were caught in the ice so strongly that they were concerned about crushing ice. When wind blows, it can be a great force and can really damage a ship greatly. So they were stuck there. So much ice that the officer in charge from the ship was able to walk ashore. It's about a 6 mile walk over. I think it was 6 miles. I hope there are not many fact checkers here because I'm not looking at my notes, but a number of miles walked over to Nantucket, called up his supervisors up in Boston. This is still the U.S. Lighthouse establishment, the supervisors in Boston, and said, "I think we need some assistance out here. We need to bring the lightship in and get them out, or we're going to be crushed when things free up in the spring." The problem is when they're in the ice itself, when it's solid, there isn't as much danger as it starts to break up, and then the wind can force it in and crush it. Well, the people in Boston said, "Go back. We don't abandon lightships. You need to stay there." So they did, and the ship was lost, and all the crew was lost when the ice broke up in the spring. So another type of shipwreck. Uh, this is the Somerset. The Somerset, not an actual photograph on the left hand side. It's an example of a British frigate, the Somerset. It was in Washington. It was in Boston. This particular ship was in Boston at the time with Paul Revere roaring across the harbor. during his start of his theoretical midnight ride. But that ship I got a lot of criticism. The captain got a lot of criticism because of Paul Revere on a moonlit night getting slipping by them and getting over to Charleston and then riding out to Concord. But that ship 2 years later was down off Cape Cod and was caught in a vicious storm and was washed ashore and broke apart. And the crew of about 400, most of them were saved, but they were captured. Captured is probably an overstatement, but they were rounded up because they were in pretty tough shape by the local Cape Codders, and it was a big event. These ships were dreaded, despised by the Cape Codders because of the impact on their economy of the embargoes, and then they would often come in and pillage places like Provincetown and steal all the stuff they could to keep their supplies up. And what I find interesting about this is this ship has resurfaced several times after big storms. On the right hand side, you can see, I'm not sure exactly when this photograph was taken within the last 20 years, but a big storm comes in, uncovers parts of the wreck, and then the sand will move back in and then bury it back again. This is in the National Seashore. So the National Park Service did some studies on it, took some samples of the hull. But a good friend of mine, George Price, who was the superintendent of the National Seashore down here about 15 years ago, I think he got a call. His secretary came in and said, George, I got a call from somebody that says he's the captain of the Somerset. George sort of first thought, as we all would, this ship went down over 200 years ago. There's not somebody still alive, a captain particularly. Well, it turns out, as fate would have it, it was the captain of Somerset. It was the Somerset Four, which was a naval frigate in England that was newly commissioned, and the captain was over there to see the hull and see if he could get a sample of the wood to take back to display on the ship, since it was his name, the namesake, Somerset. It turns out, some of you may know this, but by international law, when a ship goes down like this, no matter when it was, and this Somerset would be a good example, although it's on a beach on Cape Cod in Massachusetts, those remnants of that wreck are still owned by the still a property of the government of Great Britain. So this captain asking if he could get a sample, it's actually the whole thing was his. He could take the whole thing. Frankly, we wouldn't like to see that happen. It's part of our history too. But it's interesting to see even now, 200 years later, there's still parts of this particular ship, not in great shape, but this particular ship that still exists. This is a rather tragic example of also weather. Vineyard Sound lightship off the southern tip of Cuttyhunk. This is southwest of Martha's Vineyard. In a storm in 1944, a hurricane, and was lost in that storm. There were a couple signals that came up, flashing lights and so forth, that people think it may have been the lightship, but hurricane took it down. It sank in Buzzards Bay. Was divers found it several years later, and then about 20 years after that, they found it again. And then about 10 or 15 years ago, I don't remember the date exactly, Woods Hole and some Coast Guard people went out, dove on it, and recovered parts of the vessel. One of the things that was recovered was the helm or the steering wheel was brought over from a memorial that was created in New Bedford and still there. The light that was on top of the lightship we have at our museum. You can see, maybe not as obvious here, but some of the lens is cracked and broken, and the top is all partially caved in. But we look at it as a memorial to these particular sailors. I think there were about a dozen that were lost. None of them survived. Another example of weather as a cause of shipwrecks. Equipment failure. Need to see if I can find this. I can. Okay, this is the Argo Merchant. Again, it was a shipwreck back in 1976. It had about almost 8,000 gallons of oil on board. I'm sorry, barrels of oil on board. And it could have been an environmental disaster. It broke up, it hit a ledge. So that's part of the reason but for equipment failure, for among other things, the helmsmen on board were not qualified. There was a broken gyro compass. There was an inaccurate radio directional finder, incorrect charts. Generally, it was extremely poor condition. So it's not a surprise that it went aground and broke apart. The crew was able to get off. It was a good rescue that way, but the oil was all dispersed. As dumb luck would have it, for us on the Cape Cod. It happened to be a day when the wind was blowing out of the northwest. So all the oil was moved out to the North Atlantic Current or Gulf Stream and dispersed. Not that it didn't have any environmental effect, but minimal environmental impact. If it had been blowing the other way, which is not uncommon, all that oil would have come on shore on Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and the southern coast of Cape Cod. So we got lucky there. Um, Again, an example of sometimes poor equipment. It could be poorly designed equipment. I'm not going to show the drawing again, but let me mention the Pendleton that sank off of Gloucester in 1952. The Fort Mercer was another almost identical vessel was going by at the same time. They're not associated with each other, but they went by at the same time. They were prone to it had happened before where they develop cracks if it's really tough weather and it's cold out. Well, it was middle of winter. It was cold out and it was very rough weather. Both vessels broke in half within a few tens of miles of each other. And again, poor design. It was these are ships that were built for World War II for transport, and they just broke apart. Uh, um, and fortunately, we have saved Bernie Weber. If you've seen the film, Bernie Weber was a coxswain going out from Gloucester that saved 32 people. I may have on occasion, he hasn't come in yet. We have a cat that's named after Bernie Weber. Bernie was a hero, saving with his crew, saving these 32 people. I define a hero someone going out that doesn't really think there's much of a chance he's going to make it back, frankly. But it's a hero. He's risked his life to save others, and they saved 32. So Bernie was a hero in my mind and virtually everybody's mind. But Bernie Weber, the cat, is named after him. Webb, the cat, frankly, isn't that much of a hero. He's just a cat. Um, Next one is collision. Some of you may remember the India Doria, 1956. Again, near and dear to my heart. My wife's grandmother was supposed to be on the India Doria for this cruise coming across the Atlantic. She actually she was over in Italy, chose to fly back, but it was an event that it was so close to the state. There weren't that many people that were lost. There were a total of 51 people that were lost with a crew of, or there were 1,700 on board. So there were some lost, but this was a collision. This was the Stockholm, which was also a cruise ship, somewhat smaller than the Andrea Doria. I guess for gross weight, it was about half the size, but the Andrea Doria was a little over 800 feet, and the um, ship that hit it was about 500 and some odd feet. But the Stockholm had a reinforced hull bow because it operated up in the ice in Scandinavia. And that reinforced hull T-boned, and essentially the collision. I won't go into the details of how it happened. There were just a lot of human error that caused a mess. They're both fairly new vessels. The Andrea Doria was the proud of Italy. This is the pride of Italy. This was built just after World War II and all the embarrassment of World War II and losing it, and then Mussolini and all that. This was a vessel they're extremely proud of. And when it collided and sank, it was a major thing for the country of Italy. But it sank. Interestingly, uh, it's sitting down at about 160 feet of water. Well, that's just deep enough so that it uh, people can sort of dive on it. It's very, very deep for diving. There had been almost as many people that have died diving on the Andrea Doria wreck than there were lost. Well, almost as many. I think are half. There's some 20 some odd people that have died there that we know of diving on the Andrea Doria, and there are 50 that were lost during the collision itself. There are all sorts of stories about that rescue that are traumatic, but essentially um, almost split the Andrea Doria in half because of this reinforced hull of the Stockholm that hit it, and it went down fairly rapidly. I have several friends that were there at the time on some of the Coast Guard vessels that um, were responding to this. It happened to be the largest, I believe this is accurate to say, the largest civilian rescue of passengers from any shipwreck, meaning there were a lot of other ships in the area, including the Stockholm, that came immediately. The Coast Guard was out there within a short time, but a lot of the people would be able to rescue before the Coast Guard got there. So it was a great effort on everyone's part to save as many people as it did. So let me move along here. Hostility. This Some of you may be aware of this. It's the Wilhelm Gustloff, 1945. It was a major vessel in Germany. It was used by a couple of the work unions there to take their members out on cruises. And before the war, and even during the war, with escorts, it was a luxury yacht. But at the end of the war, when there were still a lot of Germans in Prussia, there was a great pressure coming from the Russians coming in and others that they tried to get everyone out of there. So they loaded up this vessel, usually accommodates about 1,500 people. They had almost 10,000 people on board. They get out, and then a Russian sub came and fired on it and sank it. It was considered a war crime by some, but frankly, there were German soldiers on board and sailors, and they had some armament on board. So technically it wasn't a war crime, but boy, it was a major loss of life. Nearly 10,000 people were lost. This may be the largest loss of life for any shipwreck ever in the history of mankind. This one is, again, near and dear to our hearts, the Coast Guard. It was the Coast Guard got to Tampa. During World War One. It was sitting off of Ireland, I believe, when it was hit by a U-boat, sank. Everyone on board died. 120 people, 111 Coast Guard people. It's the largest event Coast Guard's ever had that much of loss of life with one sinking of a ship or one accident. In addition, it happened to be the largest naval loss of people during the entire war, World War One. Uh, so again, wartime is kind of a different thing altogether when you're talking about loss of life. There are many other examples I can give of where ships have been lost that lost several thousand people, well above the Titanic during wartime. The Lusitania would be one of them. Many of these events were historic, even history changing events. The Lusitania went down in 1915. It didn't directly stimulate America to go into World War One. It was another year and a half or 2 years later, but it was very much based on this sinking because there were several Americans on board the Lusitania when it went down. That stimulated the U.S. to go into the war a year and a half or 2 years after it sank. Uh, there's a picture of it today. It's still sitting at the bottom off of guess off of Ireland, somewhere close to Great Britain. I'm stumbling here because I've got notes here, but I've lost where I'm going to know. That's all right. I'll just go on anyway. Coastal hazards. This is the Sparrowhawk. The Sparrowhawk was a 40-foot vessel that was coming across the Atlantic. It was that first wave of European immigration. It was 6 years, 1626, 6 years after the Mayflower came. It was about a quarter the size of the Mayflower, had 25 passengers on board. The Mayflower, I think, had 135. This is a fairly small vessel, but it made it across the Atlantic, sort of. They're having scurvy, they're running out of water and fluid. They're heading toward Jamestown. Finally got near Cape Cod, and the captain was very badly ill, was very ill, I should say. And all the passengers took the vessel over and ran it aground in Orleans on Cape Cod. And they're all able to get off, assisted by many of the Native Americans, the Wampanoag Native Americans assisted them. They tried to refloat the ship and took it out once quickly, and it then went aground again. They finally gave up, and all the passengers went up to Plymouth Plantation to Plymouth. And the next year, they were taken down to Jamestown to continue their journey. But this is the oldest relic that still survives from that first migration of Europeans to the New World. This was what you see here is a drawing of it when it was recovered in Orleans back in the mid 1800s. It's now the skeleton, about the way you see it here, is now in storage up in Plymouth at the whatever it's called, the Mayflower Memorial there, the warehouse they have in Plymouth for this. So it's interesting, but interesting particularly since it was the first documented shipwreck in North America for Europeans. I would assume, well, I would assume probably the others that came over from Europe earlier than that, fishermen and other explorers may have lost a ship here and there. And certainly Native Americans were out in the water some too. They may have lost a ship. This is the first one documented, those lost. Improper cargo storage. Now, I think many of you know about well, cargo storage is basically when the cargo shifts on board the ship and it gets unstable, then rolls over typically. The Edmund Fitzgerald was a great example of that. It was a sad example of that in the Great Lakes, where they had cargo on board, and whether it's stone or whether it's sand, it can act almost like a fluid when you start to roll around. It'll shift from one side to the other. That's clearly what happened to the Argo to the Edmund Fitzgerald. But here's another example: the Eastland. Eastland. I don't want to talk about. I apologize talking people as cargo, but this was a large ship that was moving. Try to confirm my notes here. Was on a dock in Chicago in the 1915, and they were loading people on board for a picnic, the company picnic they were going to, and um, they everyone was on board, but up high on the deck, no one was below deck because there's things to see. They all kind of got on one side of the ship, and the ship became unstable and rolled over, and they a lot of the passengers passed away. I'm looking for my notes. I apologize for this. Um, Let me leave it with the fact that there were um, several hundred. My memory seems to say about 1,000 people that died on it. There were several. There were many that were rescued, but it was a case of cargo shifting. In this case, people on the wrong side and in the wrong place that caused the ship to roll. Again, another thing, the area of Cape Cod that and Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket is considered one of the major graveyards of the North Atlantic. The other is up, if you look at this drawing up high here, is the Sable Island. Just happens to be an island out here in a very inconvenient location for ships, not well marked. And there are a lot of shipwrecks up there. And then obviously down here in the Bahamas and southern tip of Florida is also a graveyard. Not only because there are a lot of islands and stuff to run into there and low visibility, but as you know, a place that's prone to very severe weather, such as hurricanes, as we've experienced recently and experienced through history. Um, and then Charleston, I mean, the Outer Banks of Virginia and North Carolina is also another graveyard. But there have been, as I mentioned earlier, off of Cape Cod, about 3,000 or more. We don't know how many there have been. We know that probably at least 3,000 because many ships would leave from Salem, Boston, head out, or Nantucket, head out to maybe from Salem going to the Orient, from leaving from Boston, just doing coastal cargo movement, or it could be a vessel leaving from Nantucket or New Bedford going out to do whaling, and they would not come home. So who knows where they went down? It could have been thousands of miles away, or it could have been near Cape Cod. But it's clear that there were several thousand shipwrecks off Cape Cod since the 1600s. But why? Topography, and I apologize, this is a little bit washed out, I think, for you. Topography is part of it. This is showing Nantucket Sound, Martha's Vineyard over to the left here, and then Nantucket here, and a Cape up in here, then Monomoy Island going in here. But the blue areas indicate shoal water. So you can see where someone unfamiliar would be hard to get through, particularly these areas up in here by Monomoy Island. To come down through here is difficult. So a lot of shipwrecks. The Nantucket Lightship, which I showed earlier, is way down to the south here on this particular drawing. But the topography is what led to shipwrecks too, particularly when you're in a storm, you go aground. I'll show something if we get to it here in a few minutes of even modern day. It's a problem. Heavy traffic. This shows the shipping lanes today. Shipping lanes coming out of Boston heading south. This was the interstate highway system of the time. We didn't have Eisenhower's interstate highway. Most of the commerce and goods were transported by ship. Um, Bad weather, clearly. For those that come down and visit us here on the Cape, look at say, well, this is how can shipwrecks? It's just sand and little gentle waves coming in. Well, I have to tell you, it's not always the way it is on Cape Cod. And even if you're stuck in sand, the waves being on the side of the ship will break it up, particularly large waves will break it up very fast. Um, I was going to spend out of time right now because we're almost out of time to get to questions, but this is an example of a nor'easter showing a low pressure. Those black arrows is my attempt to show wind going around. I should point out that my graduate work was in oceanography and meteorology, so I was trying not to avoid getting into this too much. But you can see over by Cape Cod here, the wind coming out of the northeast just drove the ship, particularly a ship like a square rigger. It would drive it into the shore, and that was part of the reason for all the shipwrecks along here. Not only weather, but also the topography. I apologize for this. This was fog. If those that know the expression "bagawi," I won't go into what it means, but it's a little um, inappropriate in mixed crowds to mention. It was a race that Kennedy would have over to Nantucket each year, and the expression you can figure it out, I guess, where the Fagawi is the race, the Fagawi race, and it was always foggy during the time the race was going on in Nantucket Sound, and they really didn't know in many cases where they were. Back in the before the turn of the century, there was no ship-to-shore communication. Even the first decade of the 20th century, there wasn't communication. That not only includes voice, but signals that would go out to warn people. You know, towers went up later, and now I've got good coverage. The what's shown here on the right is the EPIRB. I mentioned it in passing for the sinking of the Italian gold off of the northern tip of Cape Cod. They had EPIRB on board that immediately notified the Coast Guard that there was a an event, more than likely a shipwreck. Lack of response resources. There weren't response resources back, and certainly in the 18th, 19th, and even well, 18th, 16th, 17th, 18th century. There just weren't people around. There were wreckers and mooncussers. Wreckers were actually it was actually a legitimate occupation. Or if a ship went down, some of the wreckers would go out and save people from the ship because no one else would do it. And at that point, they could once they got people ashore, they go back and take a cargo off the ship since it's going to break apart. And anyway, they were actually endorsed by the England. They said you can do this, but we require you to pay us 10% of whatever you recover. The mooncusser is a less enviable and honorable position. Mooncussers, it was people that would put false lights on the shore to draw ships in, thinking that there were navigational aids, and they would wreck on the shore. Mooncussers, as the name would imply, they cussed at the moon when it was out because the visibility was too good for their techniques to work. So they were notorious. All sorts of stories about that that I could tell, but don't have the time right now. Then more rescue came in. The Lighthouse Service came in. The Massachusetts Humane Society was the oldest rescue organization. This is different from pets. This was the people. This is an organization that was formed in 1786 to help with the amount of sailors and merchantmen that were being lost at sea. They eventually led to these boats, and the U.S. Life Saving Service came in after them to take over those duties. And we have modern resources, obviously, that have made all the difference in the world, particularly helicopters, not just the helicopter himself, but the rescue swimmer program where they're able to do a lot of rescues. I want to go through just a couple, and I'll have to go through them very fast now. The city of Columbus was a wreck that was in the 1880s. It was a ship that was coming out of Boston, routinely coming out of Boston, going to Charlestown back and forth, and it carried passengers on board. In the winter, it was coming out of Boston. You can see the red track coming down through Nantucket Sound and then the north shore of Martha's Vineyard, then continuing the open ocean down to Charleston. Um, as it rounded by Nobsca Light, which is by Woods Hole, heading south, they had gotten through the worst part of Nantucket Sound. It was just a straight shot down. So the captain went to lay down for a few minutes and left his first mate up on deck. And he said, when you get to Tarpaulin Light, which you can see about halfway down, he said, just take a right, come right about 15 degrees, follow the track line down. Well, they missed that turn and continued down and went on to a ledge down here and hard onto the ledge off of Gay Head or Aquina. This is in the middle of the night. There were 130 some odd people on board. They lost about over 100 of them. All the women and children. It was packed with women and children because they're heading to Charleston for vacation during the mid late winter. All the women and children were lost, primarily because the captain called them all up on deck to tell them what was going on and get them into lifeboats. And at that very moment, unfortunately, a large wave came through and washed them all over the side. There were some people who survived, some of the crew, and not to fault the crew that per se. I mean, going around was the fault of the captain and the officers, but the crew helped out as best they could to save people. But they were some of the ones that saved, and some of the men on board were saved too, primarily because they were trying to get things ready to save the women and children, who again were lost all within the first 20 minutes of going aground. The Wampanoag tribe was the Mass Humane Society boat that was the first out there to help out to rescue people. This is a drawing, a painting that was done by the first officer on the Dexter, shown in the foreground here, revenue cutter that showed up in the early morning or the mid morning to help out with the rescue from the. This is supposed to be the city of Columbus. City of Columbus, by the way, is the name of the vessel, not a geographic city or metropolitan area. Up on the shoal, up in here, you can see a lighthouse. That's Gay Head Light. What is significant about this drawing is that these three organizations, the Lighthouse Service, the Lighthouse Establishment, the Mass Humane Society, which then became the U.S. Life Saving Service, and then the Revenue Cutter Service, all came together in the early part of the 20th century to form what is the modern Coast Guard today. This is one of the first drawings I've seen where all three of them are depicted doing a rescue. A tragic event. It had a lot of publicity. It was the biggest marine disaster that the we'd had during that century, as far as the public response and the notoriety and the so forth. I won't. I'm just going to show a few other things. I can't get through all of this. The Austria was a vessel that caught fire. Interesting how it caught fire, but again, can't get into that. And it led to changes. For example, an organization called the U.S. Um, Steamship Authority or Bureau was formed to kind of prevent these accidents. There are many, many accidents that occurred with as steamships are coming in. There are other things that happen. Light ships were placed throughout Nantucket Sound to help people through there. The After the Titanic sank, there were all sorts of changes that occurred, including something called the SOLAS, Safety of Life at Sea Convention, in about 2 years after the Titanic sank, that made all sorts of regulatory changes. The structure of the vessels, their integrity, the amount of life rafts they had in shore, but also led to an interesting. This is where the Titanic sank. If you don't know, this is Newfoundland up here, Nova Scotia over here. Then the Titanic is this little red dot in the center. Um, but there was something called the International Ice Patrol. I said that shipwrecks had an impact in my life. I was the staff oceanographer and the deputy of the International Ice Patrol for 4 years, and our role was to track icebergs coming down from Greenland, making sure they didn't get into the shipping lanes. We couldn't avoid them getting into shipping lanes, making sure that ships that were coming across the Atlantic were aware of where the icebergs were, and then uh, it was so successful that we have not lost a ship through a collision of the iceberg since the Titanic, at least in the shipping lanes. This is the Coast Guard out by icebergs. This is some of the currents. I was going to spend a minute on this, but we don't have time. Maybe another lecture. I'm an oceanographer, so this whole idea of icebergs and the movement of icebergs. This is me up on the glaciers on the west coast of Greenland, studying some of the glaciers back in the 70s, and then a fixed wing aircraft, the C-130, flying by icebergs. Again, our role was to track the icebergs, go back to their source, see when they're being produced, and then many other changes have occurred to make it much safer today than it was back 100, 200 years ago. Electronics, naval architecture, training, weather forecasting, all things make it a little safer, but not infallible. Again, I'll just touch on this quickly. This is the Royal Majesty in 1995, went aground within sight of a lighthouse on Nantucket. And it one of my one of my peers that was doing the investigation, Captain Bernie Turlow, said to the press when he got back in and talked about what caused the accident. It was navigational, it was complacency, frankly, the navigational errors with their equipment. And he said, every once in a while you need to look out the window because in this case there was a lighthouse within sight, but they were so dependent on the electronics that they missed that opportunity. Of course, Costa Concordia, I think most of you are aware, that's the one sank back a few years ago in Italy. Again, complacency, human error, stupidity. Finally, the Iona, which is one of our high-speed passenger boats that take people from Hyannis over to Nantucket, went aground about 7 years ago, and it was clearly complacency. They had the best navigational equipment ever. The captain and the pilot on board had done this hundreds, literally hundreds, if not 1,000 times, gone in and out of this harbor. But there were some ships that were there, some sailboats, and it just looked different to them. They made a mistake and they ran up on a breakwater. By the way, being on board ships, that's something to be avoided. Is going up on a breakwater like that. It's no good for your career. And then, of course, the implosion of the Titan just recently, another example of a shipwreck, I suppose. Um, and finally, I throw this up here. People may not appreciate our icebreakers in the Arctic. This is a new icebreaker we're just building. It's about $1 billion a copy. We've got three of them coming out to spend more time up in the Arctic, primarily research and other things, but also to show a military presence in the Arctic, particularly the presence of the Russians who have always been there, but increasing the size of their fleet. And also the Chinese are spending more time in the Arctic as we start to get those waters more and more open from warming, environmental warming. There are ships now, cruise ships that go across the whole, what used to be called the Northwest Passage, a very tough route. Now, cruise ships, some of the years, are able to get across the entire Northwest Passage to Alaska from the Atlantic. So, having said that, I apologize. It's always the problem is covering everything. Hopefully, you got enough out of this to be intrigued. And I will mention the Coast Guard Heritage Museum on Cape Cod. We're only open for another week and a half now. We close on Veterans Day, but we're open about 6 months of the year and have a lot of these stories. We can tell those stories there or on our website. So please join us sometime. Mina, you've got it.
I'm here, Greg. That was amazing. Do you want to stop your share so we can just chat for a little while with
Oh
questions?
yes, I'm sorry. Yes,
Okay. So, first question is, can you explain rogue waves? Oh, I want to remind everybody to put their questions in the Q&A because it's easier for me to keep track of. So, yeah, rogue waves.
Well, the simplest thing is that they're very large waves, but what causes them is a little bit more difficult to explain. Um, Waves can join together. You can have a wave system produced by one storm, and then other waves produced by other storms. They come together in one area, and if their frequency is just right, they amplify each other. You can get an odd rogue wave. It's not common, but they're very common off the east coast of Africa. There's tends to be a place where rogue waves occur, but it's a super type of wave where you might have a bunch of waves going by that are 10 or 15 feet, and all of a sudden you get two of them that merge together at just the right angle, and you might get a rogue wave that might be 30 or 40 feet tall. So it's interesting phenomena. There's a lot more to it. Again, as an oceanographer, I could spend more time talking about, but I won't. Not that it's terribly complicated. It just takes a while to explain that it's not interference. In some cases, interference actually the opposite can happen of a rogue wave, where two wave systems come together and get a place where there's no wave at all for a while, just because the two have canceled each other out.
Is that what happened? Well, I've only seen the movie and read the book. The Perfect Storm. Was it a rogue wave?
No, that was just the perfect storm. It was the storms, and again, I won't get into this too, but there are three things that impact the size of waves. One is the intensity of the wind, obviously, the duration, the amount of time it's blowing, and the fetch over one area. If you have a storm that has wind coming from one direction over a long period of time and a high wind, they'll build it up. And that's what happened with the perfect storm. We got these gigantic waves, 60, 70 feet and for the vessel like the Andrea Gale, smaller vessel that can be traumatic. So um, I don't think those pictures in a film were too much exaggerated.
Oh,
It's amazing. I've been out in 40-foot seas before on a much larger vessel, and they get your attention.
yeah. Well, I mean, the Poseidon adventure comes, to mind where the wave just came and the whole thing just went sideways in the movie. So I'm sure that it's, that's just slightly exaggerated, but cool. Except for all those people that died. It was just terrible. So is the USCG part of DOD or still under DHS? A little bit alphabet
Good
soup for
question,
you.
and I'll try to give it. The Coast Guard has been under the seven different departments over since it was formed in 1790. It started out in the Treasury Department. Then, during times of war, World War I and World War II, particularly, it moved over pretty much in whole to the Department of Defense and fought with the Coast Guard officers and Coast Guard men were right next to the with the Navy. So we have our commandant and another four-star admiral from the Coast Guard sit on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So we're very much a part. We have a couple of admirals in the Pentagon, but in the late 1960s, when the new Department of Transportation was formed, the Coast Guard moved over to that. And then when Homeland Security was formed, the Coast Guard moved over to that. So we are not theoretically a part of the Department of Defense, but in many senses we are. But one quick aside there, I'll point out one of the advantages of being in the Department of Homeland Security is that we're not part of the Department of Defense in the form of enforcing laws against U.S. citizens. For example, if a drug smuggler is coming into the country and is a illegal operation, theoretically, if he's a U.S. citizen, let's say, theoretically, the U.S. Navy can't arrest him or take him under control. But we have foreseen that for years. So there are Coast Guard people on the naval vessel that can enforce laws. They have the authority to enforce the laws. The same was true with things as simple as drunk boating. The Navy can enforce that. The Coast Guard has.
Oh, interesting.
So by being out of the Department of Defense, it's actually to our advantage sometimes. But all
Hmm.
our friends are, many of my friends are Navy. We kid each other. For example, the Navy guys will kid me and say, you have to be over 6 feet tall to be in the Coast Guard. So when your ship goes down, you can wait ashore. And then I'll point out the fact that we are actually the older service. The Navy didn't reform until the late 1790s after they were disbanded after the Revolutionary War and formed again in the late 1790s. The Coast Guard origins go back to 1790 itself. So we're 7 or 8 years older than the Navy. So I remind them they should be kind to their older sister service.
They're elders, right? Do you know where the wreck of the Hesperus is?
Yeah, well, it was a Longfellow poem, frankly, but it is based on it's part friction, part it was based on the storm. I think it was the storm of it was a great blizzard of 18 something, somewhere in 18. I apologize. I should know. I should remember off the top. But that storm hit the area up by Gloucester and the North Shore of north of Boston, and there was a lot of loss of vessels and so forth. So the Hesperus, as far as I know, was never an actual vessel. It was just a poem that Longfellow used that as the wreck of the Hesperus, based on that storm.
Hmm. Okay, thank you. Actually, as a follow-up to that question, was the captain of the Hesperus warned by a sailor about bad weather?
That's the rumor. Yes, the rumor is, and he actually had his daughter on board too. The captain had the daughter on board. At least that's the way the story goes. Again,
Mhm.
how much this is true, I don't know. I think maybe some elements of truth in there. There's a lot of debate about it, but yes, he was warned about the fact that bad weather and all sorts of signs that. But again, there's a lot of macho-ness. I can make it. I've been out in storms before. I can make it. That was part of the issue, as I mentioned before, with the Italian gold is they were good people. They were good sailors, very professional, but they almost to the point of thinking they're invincible, and they're not. The oceans are unforgiving. It's a have to be careful.
So are the lakes. The Edmund Fitzgerald is one of my very favorite songs.
Yes,
Trapper.
yeah,
Anyways, Ralph wants to know, are you an aircraft pilot as well? And what was your most scary event at sea?
well, no, I was not an aircraft pilot. I spent a lot of time in aircraft because on the ice patrol up off the coast of Newfoundland and Greenland, we're on C-130s all the time, but not as a pilot. I've part of my training at the Coast Guard Academy. We went down for a couple of weeks of flight training just to be familiar with it, but certainly fell well short of becoming a pilot. No, but again, spent quite my time at the Coast Guard R&D Center, Research and Development Center, doing a lot of stuff on aircraft, fixed wing, and helicopters to determine their suitability for certain types of missions. But my scariest, at a young age, you think of things, you look back at the things now and say, boy, that should have been more scary. I should have been more scared at the time. But uh, being out on a ship in the couple hundred miles off of Cape Cod when you've got 40, 45 mile an hour, 45-foot seas, makes your eyes open up. We were the ship that I was on was designed to take rolls of about, I think it was 60, maybe it wasn't even 60, 50, 55, 56 degrees. At that point, it would continue to roll over and the top decks would shear off. And then it would, because it lost that weight up high, it would pop back up again. Well, it turned out that my cabin was in that top deck area, so that was a little scary. I don't think we're ever really in danger, but it just those are uncomfortable times. I'm trying to think if there was anything else that um, we were attacked when I was over in Italy. My island was attacked. This is a wrong. We were there because we'd been kicked out of Libya by Gaddafi. Coming, this is in the early '70s. We had a station there, but just after I left, there was a gunboat that came over to attack our station. But they figured, I think they figured there was a U.S. military station that this is a suicide mission for them. They came in to fire from their gunboat at our Loran station, our Coast Guard. It was a NATO station, and it was a ready fire aim situation. They missed the entire island. They thought they were dead. Frankly, they thought that there was no chance we're going to live through this. They missed so much that we weren't even aware until the following day. We went downtown and talked to some of the residents in town about it. We weren't even aware that we were under attack. I used the royal we because I wasn't on the island at that particular point. So I don't know. I'm trying to think if there's any scarier times, but it's invigorating. And as a young, I can think of times in a helicopter where I'm leaning out and like, geez, if I just twisted the wrong way, I could have fallen out just being careless. On the icebreaker, um, there were just these are times that are exhilarating and at the same point are dangerous, I suppose.
Mhm.
You do foolish things as a young man or a young woman, either way.
Yeah, we all do. Dan wants to know, how did the revenue cutters or service operate when it was phased out?
Well, it wasn't phased out. The Revenue Cutter Service is our one of our founding organizations. So in 1915, the Revenue Cutter Service merged with the Life Saving Service to become the U.S. Coast Guard. So U.S. Coast Guard name only goes back to 1915, but the Revenue Cutter was created on August 4th, 1790. So the Coast Guard still looks at August 4th as being its birthday. Um, so it didn't phase out. In fact, the revenue cutter officers one day, came in the next day, and they're Coast Guard officers, same uniform at that point, and it was a fairly smooth transition. And then the lighthouse service was added later, about 20 years later. Lighthouse service, all those people came under the Coast Guard, and there are so many other missions. The I mentioned the steamship inspection that came in during World War II. It had been around for quite a bit, that bureau, and ice breaking. I think people would be surprised how many missions the Coast Guard has. But the core missions are revenue cutter, which was law enforcement, life saving service, which was search and rescue, and then lighthouses, which was H navigation. Those three missions are still the three of the big core missions of the Coast Guard.
Mhm. I got an amen and thank you for your service from Ralph. Um, ooh, sorry. Um, is there a rule, Judy asks, or something about captains going down with this ship? Is that just, what is that?
Well, no, I think that's custom and tradition. Is that it's always said. We have several expressions, but the Concordia, the Costa Concordia, was an example of where that really became a legal issue. He abandoned the ship well before all the passengers get off, and he was taken to court for it because he had responsibilities he wasn't paying attention to. So tradition is that in many cases the captain is the last off. The idea is that he's in charge of the ship and he's in charge of getting everyone off safely, those that are still alive. So in most cases, the captain would be the last off, would be the honorable thing to do, let's say. One of the other expressions we have is in the Coast Guard is we try to discourage people from this expression, but you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. Meaning, if you've got a search and rescue to do, if someone's out there in distress, you have to go out. Well, we've discouraged that. We've kind of modified. In fact, I was in charge of the Coast Guard search and rescue program at Coast Guard headquarters. And our mantra was, we want you to go out, we want you to go out with the right equipment and the right training. If the seas are too much for you, we have other resources we can send. So you don't have to go out. We're going to send somebody out. We're going to leave people out there. It could be a helicopter, could be something else that can do the rescue. So you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. Yes, we want you to come back. Uh,
Of course.
Sort of like, yes.
Um, just a couple more questions. What is the history of the bell behind you on the mantle? I think we got asked that last time too. There's a bell up on
Um,
your mantle.
yes, the history is I grew up in a town called Belchertown. Some of you may know it. It's out near Quabbin Reservoir, out near Amherst. And my great grandfather, there was a mill down by the railroad tracks that was a lumber mill, I think, or it may have been fabric. I'm not quite sure it was in the late 1800s. And at the start of the workday, he would take the bell with a cart and he'd ring the bell, and people come to his cart and he'd drive them down that half mile or three-quarters mile to the mill. So it has no nautical. It's I have a lot of nautical stuff here, but the bell doesn't have to do with nautical. We do have wire on bells, though. We have a bell on at the museum that was recovered a few years ago off Nauset Beach, and a lot of barnacles and things on it. We identified it. We got a lot of the barnacles off, and it was a something that was when it was being forged, a logo was put in. It says USLHE, which was significant. U.S. lighthouse establishment. Well, the lighthouse establishment existed up until the turn of the century, just after the turn of the century, early 1900s, and that became the U.S. Lighthouse Service. Uh, so at that point, we got some idea how old the bell was. Then there was a logo further down with a little more a little more scraping that we got that said McShane. McShane is a bell manufacturer just outside of Baltimore that was created in the just before the Civil War. So now we've narrowed it down more. So we went to McShane with that and said, okay, what can you tell us about this? And they identified it as from 1895, give or take a year or two. And more than likely, it was a bell buoy. It was a 200-pound bell. But we're not totally convinced that it couldn't be the bell from the Cross Shrips lightship that we talked about earlier, that was taken out by the ice and was drifted out into the North Atlantic and sank. No one's ever found the wreck of it at all. Maybe it could be from that. I think unlikely, but could be.
Okay. Two more questions. Because you mentioned your great grandfather. Was your great grandfather's shipwreck something that inspired you to learn more about shipwrecks?
I, no, I don't think so. Certainly I remember that. I put that in there because it was part of my history. But no, it wasn't inspiration. It just sort of by chance, of by coincidence, I got into the Coast Guard. I didn't get into the Coast Guard because of my grandfather being on a shipwreck, but frankly, some of the stuff that drove is the wrong term, got me interested in the Coast Guard is my experiences down here in Cape Cod as a kid during the summertime and exploring the Brewster Sand Flats and going out. And I really wanted to be involved in oceanography. Apparently, I was very, very competitive to get into the Coast Guard Academy, so it was great enough to get in, but didn't have a lot of common sense because I really wanted to be a marine science major. And after going through all the competition and getting into the Coast Guard Academy, I felt very fortunate to be able to select it. And I got there and said, okay, I want to sign up after I'd been there for a week or two, sign up for what my major was going to be. And they said, we don't have a marine science major. I said, oh shit,
Oh,
excuse the
no.
expression. The so It turned out again dumb luck on my part. About a year later, they introduced the marine science major, and I was our class, the first class to go through in it. So that stimulated as much as anything else. But to answer your question about shipwrecks, obviously it's part of my career, obviously. But as I got here 9 years ago as the president of the Coast Guard Heritage Museum, it became more of interest, particularly as we've just talked about today. Hopefully, it's been the case. They're intriguing. They're a little bit morbid, but intriguing and a good story to tell. Whether I've done that story well or not, I'm not sure. But it's an easy story to tell, and most people are very interested in it. There are so many. Each one of these shipwrecks, we could do a whole lecture on that particular shipwreck, what happened, what caused it, and the loss of life. The Titanic obviously has been done many times, but uh, shipwrecks are just fun to do. That's just one of the talks that's intriguing. I will mention one thing I mentioned to Mina here a while ago. I think when the people that came to my last talk on Coast Guard history may have remembered me mentioning that we're working on a major painting for the State House up in Boston. mean, this is a major painting. This will be a major addition to the Great Hall in the State House that will be celebrating the 18th century birth of the Coast Guard in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So we will have a painting there. We've just got through selecting the artist a couple weeks ago, and he's starting. It'll be a year process. This is not a cheap project. I think it's going to be 150 to $200,000 for this painting, a gigantic painting that'll be in a state house, and it's that early history. So things like that going on, along with the intrigue of shipwrecks and the history, the deep history of the Coast Guard, particularly in Massachusetts, that intrigue me.
Mhm. I think it's intriguing for all of us. It's nice to get an overview from you. But Joe asked me this question very early on about if you're doing upcoming webinars. I know you and I were talking about doing another one maybe in April on a different topic. And then is there a place where you do webinars? Like, is that your like a list of things that you're going to be doing?
Well, I've done on a number of topics. I mentioned this talk I gave today is a new talk. I've had shipwreck talks before. Every time I send a modify it, and this one has been modified. Hopefully, they're getting better with time. But ones that I've given in the past, which I was talking to Mina about, are um, lighthouses and lightships. On its own is an interesting talk. Coast Guard history I mentioned before, the that early history and the birth of the Coast Guard. There are so many different topics. Just the whole topic of what the revenue cutter service about, and how that began, and what the role was is a topic on its own. I was talking to Mina earlier about the flight of the NC-4. The NC-4, I think I mentioned last time, but the NC-4 was the first aircraft to fly across the Atlantic Ocean 8 years before Lindbergh, and it was a heroic flight, and it's a great talk on its own. We've done talks on that. It didn't go nonstop. It didn't go solo. There were 6 people on board, but it was in 1919, and it makes for a very nice talk because there a lot of heroism involved. The to be the first across, you can imagine um, always is a challenge, and this was a challenge. So that's another talk that we'll do. But I don't know if I've answered. Do I do webinars? I don't. I haven't done that. Something maybe we should start doing at the Coast Guard Museum. Something to put in. For example, one of the ones that we've is really necessary. We have actually 4 people on our staff are indirectly related to the museum that were lightship sailors, one lightship. Remember, the last lightship was 1985 in Nantucket, and there were several, before that. Most of them were gone shortly after the World War II. But we're trying to get those lightkeepers together, the lightship sailors together, and have an event where we're asking them, interacting with them. They have all sorts of, you can imagine all sorts of intriguing stories having spent out there. The Coast Guard considered that probably one of the most dangerous duties, if not the most dangerous duty of any Coast Guard, because not just getting run over, hurricanes and all that, but just getting on and off when you go out to be relieved in rough weather, transferring from one boat to the lightship was dangerous. Not necessarily much loss of life, but broken arms, other injuries that would occur.
Mhm. So I'm going to send people in the recap email to the museum's website, and they can certainly find more information about anything that's going on there or other talks that are happening. Greg, thank you so much. This has been fascinating as always, and thank you everybody who's been here and stayed with us to have all of your questions answered. I really appreciate it, and I hope you learned a lot as I have today. Greg, I'll be in touch.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it. It's a fun to do. I appreciate that. So hope to see you again. We'll have me and I will talk about maybe next winter doing another talk on one of the topics I mentioned or something else.
Yeah.
Um,
I'll do anything. I mean, everybody just loves you. So,
I throw one other one in there. The whole issue of polar ice breaking is also an intriguing topic. Since we're getting these new icebreakers in, it may be a timely one to have one on ice breaking too.
that sounds awesome. Yeah, like I'll definitely be in touch with you and I'll let everybody know when that next one is coming up. So,
Okay, good. Well, thank
have,
you.
yep, have a great
Good to see
winter.
you. All right. Thanks a
Bye.
lot. Bye.